In the small town of Maple Ridge, life was meant to be simple. It was a place where the church bell rang on Sundays, and the pastor was seen as a pillar of the community. Pastor John, a man of unwavering faith, had served his congregation for years. His life seemed to be an open book, filled with the quiet, humble moments of a man devoted to his church and family. But what happened behind closed doors in that peaceful town would defy everything people thought they knew about trust and betrayal. For years, Pastor John's secretary, a woman who managed his schedule, his personal life, and his deepest confidences, had been his most trusted ally. She knew him better than anyone else, and to him, she was indispensable. But somewhere, in the shadows of their working relationship, something dark began to take root. A quiet resentment, perhaps, or a hidden anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. Then, one day, that anger would be unleashed in a way that no one could have ever predicted. In a chilling act of revenge, the secretary deliberately infected Pastor John with HIV, forever altering the course of his life and the lives of everyone around him. Why would she do this? What was the driving force behind this calculated, destructive act? What had Pastor John done to betray her so deeply? This was no ordinary crime. This was a calculated strike against trust, a betrayal so devastating it would unravel the very fabric of a man's life. In the coming moments, we will uncover the shocking details behind this twisted act of revenge and how it sent shockwaves through the peaceful town of Maple Ridge, shattering the lives of all involved and leaving the town forever changed. If you're new here, welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we dive deep into the most shocking and unbelievable true crime stories. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the chilling cases we cover. Now, let's begin unraveling this twisted tale together. Pastor John was a man admired by many in Maple Ridge. His deep faith, his dedication to his church, and his unwavering commitment to the community had earned him respect from everyone he encountered. For years, he had been the steady hand guiding his congregation, offering counsel, and serving as a moral compass for the people of his town. But despite the outward appearance of a perfect life, Pastor John's personal world was anything but simple. Behind the scenes, there was one person who had helped him keep everything together, a woman who managed every aspect of his day-to-day life. Her name was Secretary's name, and she had been with him for years, working tirelessly to ensure his schedule ran smoothly, appointments were kept, and his personal affairs were organized. To Pastor John, she was indispensable. He trusted her completely. She wasn't just his secretary, she was his confidant. He shared his struggles with her, and she was there when he needed support. Their professional relationship, over time, had developed into something more akin to a friendship. She knew his habits, his preferences, and the delicate balance he maintained between his church duties and his personal life. But what Pastor John didn't know was that Secretary's name had been hiding something far darker beneath the surface. While she managed his calendar, made sure his life appeared flawless, a quiet bitterness had been brewing. Over time, her feelings had shifted. The resentment that had begun as a mere annoyance had now turned into something far more dangerous. As the months went by, that bitterness grew, fueled by moments of personal dissatisfaction, perceived slights, and frustrations. She watched as Pastor John's life remained seemingly perfect, while her own remained stuck, unnoticed. And with each passing day, her resentment began to take on a more sinister form. Though outwardly calm and professional, deep inside, a fire had ignited. She felt invisible, underappreciated, and as the days passed, that feeling festered into a quiet rage. What had once been a bond of trust was now something that she would manipulate for her own twisted sense of justice. As she continued to handle Pastor John's life with meticulous care, the weight of her resentment grew. But no one knew. No one could see the dangerous thoughts swirling in her mind. It wasn't until later that anyone would realize the depth of her anger and the terrifying lengths she would go to make Pastor John feel the full force of her revenge. For years, the secretary had managed the delicate balance of her role. She smiled, nodded, and did what was expected of her. Always behind the scenes, always out of the spotlight. But the frustration, the bitterness, the feeling of being overlooked and undervalued, had begun to take its toll, and in the quiet recesses of her mind, a plan began to form. The pastor's life, once a model of faith and virtue, had grown complicated. Pastor John's relationship with his congregation had begun to shift. He had become more distant, more consumed by the demands of his ministry. His marriage was faltering, his personal life unraveling in ways that no one outside of his inner circle could understand. But despite the mounting pressure, he trusted his secretary to handle the logistics of his life. What he didn't know was that every task she performed for him, every phone call, every appointment she arranged, was feeding into her growing resentment. She saw his weaknesses, his flaws, and the cracks in the facade he so carefully maintained. And one day, something inside her snapped. She had been patient for years, silently waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. And now, she believed that moment had arrived. The resentment she had carefully hidden would no longer remain in the shadows. It would now be unleashed, in the most shocking and unimaginable way. In a chilling act of calculated revenge, she made the decision that would change everything. The secretary, who had once been the pastor's most trusted ally, decided to take control of the situation in a way no one could ever foresee. She didn't act out of impulse. No, this was no rash decision. This was premeditated, a plan that had been brewing for months, maybe even years. The secretary knew exactly what she was doing. The method, the timing, everything was calculated. And so, in the most twisted way imaginable, she set her plan into motion. The very thing that Pastor John had trusted her with, the most personal details of his life, would now become the instrument of his destruction. After months of silent resentment, the secretary's moment of reckoning had arrived. She knew the risks, the consequences of what she was about to do. But in her mind, the sense of power she would gain from finally taking control outweighed any potential fallout. She had spent so long in the background, supporting Pastor John's every move, but now she was ready to step into the spotlight in a way no one could have ever imagined. In the days leading up to the act, she had carefully planned every detail. She knew that Pastor John was facing increased pressure from the church, from his congregation, and from his own personal life. The cracks in his facade were becoming more evident, but he had no idea that the one person he trusted most was the very one who would tear everything apart. It was a routine day at the office. Pastor John was busy, as usual, preparing for a series of upcoming sermons and meetings. He didn't notice the subtle change in his secretary's demeanor, how her movements seemed a little more deliberate, her eyes a little colder. He trusted her implicitly, unaware that she had already begun the process that would unravel his life. The plan was simple, yet horrifying in its execution. Over the course of several days, the secretary had discreetly altered the contents of a prescription that Pastor John had trusted her to manage. It wasn't just any medication. It was a tool she would use to carry out her revenge. With one subtle action, she had the means to infect him, and it was a quiet, almost invisible process. No one would suspect a thing until it was too late. The secretary, with chilling precision, ensured that the pastor was exposed to a virus that would change his life forever. It was a slow burn. Pastor John wouldn't feel the effects immediately. He would go about his days, believing that nothing had changed, that his life would continue as it always had. But what he didn't know was that the clock was ticking. His world, built on trust and faith, was about to come crashing down in the most devastating way imaginable. The secretary watched as Pastor John continued with his routine, completely unaware of the consequences that would soon follow. For her, there was no turning back. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no going back. As the days passed, Pastor John continued his life as if nothing had changed. He was unaware that his world was about to shatter, that the one person he had trusted most had irrevocably altered the course of his life. His health began to deteriorate in ways that were hard to explain. At first, it was subtle: fatigue, mild headaches, and a sense of general unease. But soon, the symptoms worsened. Pastor John's body began to betray him in ways he couldn't understand. He visited his doctor, thinking it was simply stress or exhaustion from his demanding role. But the doctor's test results told a different story. What was once a simple infection had now progressed to something far more serious. The diagnosis, HIV. A disease that would change his life forever. A disease that, unbeknownst to him, had been deliberately transmitted by the one person he trusted most. Pastor John was devastated. The news felt like a punch to the gut. He had never imagined that something like this could happen to him. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend the situation. How could this have happened? Who could have done this to him? It wasn't until much later that the truth would come to light. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered, slowly began to fall into place. And the truth was far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The secretary, who had been so close to him, had quietly watched his life unravel. She had been the one to expose him to the virus, and now, she was watching from the shadows as he grappled with the devastating effects of her actions. The revelation didn't come immediately, but as Pastor John's health continued to decline, the clues started to point in one direction. The moment of truth came when Pastor John confronted his secretary. His mind, clouded by confusion and fear, finally pieced together the pieces of the puzzle. He demanded an explanation. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice trembling. The secretary's cold expression didn't change. She knew the time had come for her to face the consequences of her actions. The confession came without hesitation. She had done it. She had deliberately infected him with HIV. It was her revenge, her twisted form of justice. She had planned it carefully, knowing exactly what she was doing. "I couldn't stand watching you live your life, so perfect, so untouched by the chaos that plagued me," she told him, her voice emotionless. "You never saw me. You never appreciated me. And now, I'm taking control of everything." The gravity of her words sank in. The betrayal was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The woman he had trusted with his life, his ministry, had been the one to destroy him. But this was only the beginning. The revelation of her actions would set off a chain of events that would leave a permanent mark on the community, on his congregation, and on the life of the pastor himself. As the truth spread throughout the small town of Willowbrook, the once tight-knit community was left in shock. The revelation that a trusted member of the church, Pastor John's secretary, had deliberately infected him with HIV sent ripples of disbelief through the congregation and beyond. This was a town where faith was everything, and the pastor had been the guiding light for so many. To learn that the woman who had stood by his side for years was the one to destroy him was unfathomable. The congregation, who had seen the pastor as a pillar of strength and morality, struggled to comprehend the gravity of what had occurred. They had always known the secretary to be reliable, dedicated, and loyal. To find out that she had been hiding such a dark secret, one that could destroy a life and a ministry, was something none of them were prepared for. Some were quick to turn their backs on Pastor John, unable to reconcile the truth of the situation with the image they had held of him. Others questioned how he could have been so blind, so unaware of the resentment brewing within his own office. But for those who had truly known the pastor, the shock wasn't just about his infection. It was about the betrayal that had come from someone he had trusted so completely. The pastor's personal and professional life crumbled. His health deteriorated further as the effects of the virus took hold. But it wasn't just his body that was breaking down. It was his spirit, his faith, and his relationship with the community he had served for so long. He withdrew from his congregation, unable to face them after the scandal that had unfolded. He could no longer stand in the pulpit, offering words of comfort and wisdom when his own life was in shambles. The secretary, on the other hand, faced a different kind of fallout. She had destroyed the life of the man she had once worked so closely with, and now she was the one under scrutiny. She was arrested and charged with deliberate transmission of a deadly disease, a crime that carried severe consequences. But even as she faced legal repercussions, she seemed unfazed, almost detached from the devastation she had caused. The legal battle that followed was long and public, with the entire town watching as the case unfolded. Pastor John, too, was forced to face his own demons. His physical illness, his fractured faith, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had shaken him to his core. He struggled to rebuild his life, unsure of where to turn or how to heal from the scars left by his trusted secretary. But perhaps the most haunting question of all remained. Why had she done it? What drove this woman, once so loyal, to commit such a horrific act? As the trial continued, the motivations behind her actions became clearer. The secretary had not just been seeking revenge for a personal slight or betrayal. No, her reasons ran deeper, much deeper than anyone had imagined. And as the town continued to watch the proceedings, the true nature of the secretary's twisted actions began to emerge. It was not just about revenge. It was about control, about power, and about making sure that she would never again be overlooked. The town of Willowbrook would never be the same. Pastor John's ministry would never be the same. And the lives of everyone involved would be forever altered by the devastating choices made in the name of revenge. As the trial of Pastor John's secretary began, the town of Willowbrook braced itself for the public spectacle that was about to unfold. The courthouse was filled with people, many of them longtime churchgoers who had watched the secretary work alongside Pastor John for years. No one could have predicted how the case would unfold, or how much darker the story would become. Pastor John sat in the front row, his face pale, his hands shaking. He had never imagined that his life would come to this. A public trial, a woman he had once trusted standing trial for his health, his very existence. But now, he had no choice but to face the woman who had so callously destroyed everything he had worked for. The secretary, now facing charges of deliberate transmission of HIV, sat in the defendant's chair. Her demeanor was strikingly calm, almost cold. She showed no emotion as the prosecutor presented evidence of the deliberate actions she had taken to infect Pastor John. The court was presented with testimonies from doctors, experts, and friends who spoke about her behavior leading up to the crime, how she had manipulated situations, kept her bitterness hidden, and quietly harbored resentment for years. But it wasn't until the defense began its case that the true depth of the secretary's motivations started to come into focus. Her attorney argued that she had acted out of deep emotional distress, citing years of unrequited loyalty and the way she had been treated by Pastor John. According to her, she had felt unseen, unappreciated, and ignored by the very man she had devoted her life to serving. She claimed that over the years, her efforts had been taken for granted, and that her emotional needs had been neglected. She did not start out with the intention of destroying him, the defense attorney argued. She felt betrayed, abandoned, and alone. Pastor John's indifference to her years of hard work pushed her to a breaking point. She did what she did not out of malice, but out of a need to make him feel what she had been feeling for years, neglected and invisible. The prosecution, however, was quick to counter this defense. They argued that no amount of emotional distress could justify such a horrific act. The deliberate nature of the crime, the premeditation, the care she had taken to ensure that the virus was transmitted, all pointed to a calculated act of revenge, not a desperate cry for attention. The emotional toll on Pastor John was palpable. Each new revelation about the secretary's actions was a blow to his already fragile state. He had once trusted her with his deepest thoughts, his ministry, and his personal life. To now hear that she had been harboring resentment and a desire for revenge for so long was more than he could bear. The court case went on for weeks, and with each passing day, the details of the secretary's twisted actions were laid bare. The more the community learned about her motivations, the more they struggled to reconcile the woman they had known with the monster that had emerged in the courtroom. The betrayal was deep, and the community felt it. The most chilling revelation came when the secretary herself took the stand. She was asked to explain, in her own words, why she had done it. Her response was haunting. "I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to be invisible," she said, her voice devoid of remorse. "He had everything, his health, his family, his ministry, and I had nothing. I wanted him to feel what I felt. I wanted him to know what it was like to have everything ripped away from you, without warning, without mercy." The room fell silent as her words sank in. It was clear that this was not just an act of revenge. It was an attempt to make Pastor John feel the same pain and helplessness she had experienced. But the reality of what she had done was far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The jury deliberated for days, weighed down by the complexity of the case. Was it a crime born of deep emotional pain, or was it the cold, calculated act of a woman bent on revenge? The answer would come soon, but for now, the town of Willowbrook could only watch and wait. The days following the final arguments were filled with tension and uncertainty. The jury, burdened with the weight of the case, deliberated for hours. The town of Willowbrook held its collective breath, unsure of what would come next. The trial had revealed the depths of betrayal and revenge, but would the verdict match the severity of the crime? Would justice be served, or would the community be forced to reconcile with a broken system that allowed such horrors to unfold? Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The tension was thick as everyone waited for the decision that would determine the fate of the woman who had once been a trusted figure in their lives. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. The defendant, in the case of the state versus Jessica Lee, how do you find the defendant? After careful deliberation, we find the defendant guilty of deliberate transmission of a deadly disease with intent to harm. The verdict was clear. Jessica Lee, the woman who had once been Pastor John's most trusted ally, was found guilty of deliberately infecting him with HIV. The community's sense of disbelief morphed into a collective wave of shock, relief, and anger. Pastor John's life had been irrevocably altered by her actions, and now, so too would hers. But the punishment would not be the end of the pain. The consequences of her actions stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As Jessica was led away in handcuffs, the town began to reckon with the aftermath of her betrayal. The prison sentence was harsh, but it could never undo the damage she had caused. Pastor John, despite the verdict, still found himself trapped in the aftermath of her actions. His health was deteriorating, and the emotional toll of the betrayal was taking its own heavy toll on him. He withdrew further from the community, unsure of how to rebuild his life, his ministry, and his faith. But there was no escaping the questions that lingered in the air. Could he ever forgive her? Could he ever regain the trust of his congregation? Or would he always be defined by this dark chapter in his life? The town, too, struggled to find answers. The once peaceful community was now divided, torn between those who believed Pastor John had been wronged and those who still struggled to comprehend how such a betrayal could happen. For Jessica, the journey was far from over. In prison, she would face her own demons, wrestling with the consequences of her actions and the cold realization that she had forever altered the lives of everyone around her. Her resentment, once so hidden, had led to an irreversible act that had cost her everything. Yet, even in the isolation of her cell, she seemed to carry a sense of detachment, as if the gravity of what she had done hadn't fully sunk in. The trial and the aftermath had torn apart the very fabric of Willowbrook. What had once been a quiet, faith-driven community was now scarred by the actions of one woman. But in the wake of the verdict, Pastor John found a glimmer of hope. Slowly, he began to rebuild. He started by reaching out to those who had stood by him, those who still believed in his mission, despite the pain he had endured. The road to recovery would be long, and there were still many unanswered questions, but Pastor John knew that the journey toward healing would have to begin within. For now, he had to find peace with his past, and, perhaps, one day, he could learn to forgive. The town of Willowbrook would never be the same, but perhaps, in time, both the pastor and the community could begin to heal from the wounds left by this shocking betrayal. As the months passed after the trial, the story of Pastor John and Jessica Lee continued to haunt Willowbrook. The community, once unified by faith, now struggled to come to terms with the betrayal that had shattered their trust. The lines between victim and perpetrator were blurred, leaving many with unanswered questions about the true nature of redemption and forgiveness. Pastor John, though still grappling with the trauma of what had transpired, began to rebuild his ministry, step by painful step. The path was far from easy. There were whispers, questions about his ability to ever fully heal, and concerns that his reputation could never be fully restored. Yet, in the midst of this, a quiet transformation was occurring. He found solace in small moments, moments that reaffirmed his faith and the very essence of his calling. His journey of healing was one of self-forgiveness, an attempt to reconcile the betrayal with his own sense of worth. Could he forgive Jessica? Could he forgive himself for not seeing the signs? The questions lingered, but Pastor John's resolve grew stronger. He knew that the road to redemption, both for himself and his congregation, was long and fraught with difficulty, but it was a road he had to travel. Meanwhile, Jessica's life in prison was one of solitude and harsh reality. Her once confident demeanor had been replaced by a deep, quiet remorse that she could not escape. Behind bars, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. The resentment that had once driven her to such a destructive act now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was the cold, unrelenting truth. Her actions had cost her everything. She began to write letters to Pastor John, letters to the people she had once known. In them, she expressed sorrow, regret, and a yearning for forgiveness. But the damage had already been done. Her letters were returned unopened, as the people she had wronged chose not to respond, unable to process the depth of her betrayal. For Pastor John, the decision to forgive Jessica was one he wrestled with daily. He sought counsel from trusted friends and members of his congregation, trying to understand what it truly meant to forgive someone who had caused so much harm. It wasn't an easy answer, but one thing became clear. Forgiveness was not for Jessica alone. It was for him, for his own peace of mind, and for the healing of his community. The question remained. Would forgiveness bring him peace, or would it reopen the wounds that had yet to fully heal? The people of Willowbrook, too, were divided. Some felt that the verdict had been just, and that Jessica's actions had forever tarnished her reputation. Others, however, believed that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. These differing views created an undercurrent of tension in the town, an unspoken debate about justice, punishment, and the possibility of second chances. But despite the tension, life in Willowbrook slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Pastor John continued his ministry, though with a renewed sense of caution. He understood now that the human heart could harbor both love and betrayal in equal measure. And perhaps it was this very understanding that would help him rebuild his shattered faith. For Jessica, the future was uncertain. She would serve her time in prison, but would she ever truly redeem herself in the eyes of those she had hurt? Would the remorse she felt be enough to make amends for the pain she had caused? Only time would tell. The possibility of redemption was distant, but not entirely out of reach. As the story of Pastor John and Jessica Lee fades into the past, the lessons learned from their ordeal remain. The power of forgiveness, the destructive force of betrayal, and the long road to redemption serve as reminders of the complexity of the human experience. In the end, only time can heal the deepest wounds, and the true cost of betrayal is something that no one can fully escape. And so, we are left with a story that lingers in the shadows of Willowbrook, a story of trust, betrayal, and the consequences of one woman's desperate act of revenge, a story that will echo through the halls of this town for years to come. Thank you for watching this documentary on the shocking case that rocked Willowbrook. If you want to dive deeper into more true crime mysteries and explore stories that reveal the dark secrets of human nature, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Mysteries. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case, and let us know what you think about the question of forgiveness in the face of betrayal. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.